Great, we're just about ready to get started. Hello, my name is Elizabeth Karcher, and I am the Executive Director at the Woodrow Wilson House in Washington, D.C. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Tuesday's Lunch and Learn session. We started it as Zoom back in June when the pandemic forced us to go online and virtual. It has continued, and we are thrilled that we are continuing to have episodes of our speaker series. Today is the 19th episode, which is rather remarkable because we have Errin Haines, who is the editor at large and co-founder of the 19th Asterix, a nonprofit independent newsroom focused on the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. She's also an MSNBC contributor. But before we get started and introducing Errin Haines, let me tell you a little bit what's happening at the Woodrow Wilson House. Unfortunately, due to COVID, our museum for tours inside the house is still closed. We are welcoming guests and visitors to go online and download our walking tours of historic Kalorama and of the Waddy Butler Wood architect tours. We've got houses that are in the neighborhood. They're no longer than an hour-long walking tour, and you can download it from our website. And then one is an audio walking tour, self-guided, and one is a self-guided where you download the text and you can read it along as you walk along the neighborhood. We have our advisory council has just invited 2 new members, and we're welcoming them this month to join our advisory. That there'll be some news about that in our newsletter. We're also celebrating the 100th anniversary of the day that the Wilsons moved into the house on S Street, and that's coming up in this next month. So there's lots happening at the Wilson House that we're happy to be celebrating. Our scholars are busy at work. We have 8 this semester, and they are helping on all kinds of projects. So stay tuned to see what they've been up to. So let me tell you a little bit about our speaker today. As we said, Errin Haines is the editor at large and co-founder of the 19th. Prior to joining the 19th, Errin was national writer on race and ethnicity for the Associated Press, offering sharp news analysis and original perspectives on current events on topics including urban affairs, policing, historically Black colleges, civil rights, and the Black electorate. Errin has worked at the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Orlando Sentinel. She's also contributed to numerous outlets, including NBC News, NPR, The Guardian, Time, and Politico. Her expertise on issues of race, gender, and politics make her a sought-after voice and thought leader in her industry. She's recently taught classes on the role of Black women and the 2020 election at Georgetown University Institute of Politics and as a Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. In addition to her role as reporter, she's been a tireless champion for diversity in the media, advocating for more jobs for journalists of color in newsrooms and for fair and accurate coverage for African Americans in mainstream news outlets. From 2011 to 2015, Errin served 2 terms on the board of directors for the National Association of Black Journalists as the organization's vice president of print. She's a native of Atlanta, and she is based in Philadelphia with her dog Ginger. It's my pleasure to welcome Errin Haines to the Woodrow Wilson Speaker Series.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you so much to the Wilson House for inviting me to do this. I very much have been looking forward to this conversation as somebody who has written about, kind of the complicated legacy of President Wilson, as somebody who, had the privilege of teaching at Princeton and learning even more about, his relationship to that storied institution. It is really great to be in conversation with all of you today to talk about not only the 19th and our new newsroom and what our mission and vision is, but also, to talk about, we celebrated the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment last year. Woodrow Wilson was a part of that. 100 years ago, or when he, came into office in 1913, he came into office at the height of the suffrage movement, right? And so his evolution really around suffrage is something that is a part of that story. And so I'm eager to get into some of that too, but also just to bring it into present day and the role of women in our democracy, what we saw in the 2020 election, and what really the reckoning around issues of race and gender mean for our democracy and our society going forward. So, I guess I'll start by talking about the 19th, which we just celebrated our 1-year anniversary, which is kind of crazy to even think about, in this pandemic. But certainly didn't plan on starting a newsroom in the pandemic, but it absolutely has worked out for us, I think, in large part because we found ourselves at the intersection of a lot of different things that were happening in the country that absolutely impacted the majority of the population, the majority of the electorate, and at least, until the pandemic, the majority of the U.S. workforce, all of which, is women. So the 19th is named for the 19th Amendment, but if you have ever seen our logo, that logo has an asterisk in it. And the asterisk is for the omission of the black women who were sacrificed despite their work shoulder to shoulder with white women 100 years ago, that they were excluded from full access to the franchise when the 19th Amendment was ratified 100 years ago. And so that asterisk is really a reminder to us as our North Star as we continue to talk about the expansion of our democracy and access to the ballot for women and marginalized folks, period. We exist to be a home for all women and marginalized folks that have been excluded historically from this democracy, whether they want to live here or not, across the ideological spectrum, whether you are Democrat, Republican, Independent, or have no politics, but you care about the direction of this country and you are interested in a new narrative around gender and politics and policy in America that is not so centered on Washington, D.C. or so centered on, the coast, but really talking more about who gets to be, for example, a rural voter or a voter from the heartland or an educated voter or a faith voter, right? Voters who care about the Supreme Court. All of these issues are women's issues as far as we are concerned. And so we unpack those for our readers in a way that frankly, I did not see happening across the journalism landscape, certainly not in most legacy mainstream newsrooms. And I think a large part of that is because so many of the gatekeepers and so many of the storytellers around our political journalism are still unfortunately too white and too male, and that is the thing that needs to change. And frankly, the fastest way that we thought that we could do that was to start over. And so that's exactly what we did, and that's why we did it. And so again, we launched, we're named for the 19th, but we also launched in the suffrage year of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which we felt like was really important and really momentous. And we certainly marked that centennial as a newsroom, but, in a way that was a more honest and inclusive telling of what that centennial means and who was present at the passage of the 19th Amendment, right? Like I said, black women certainly were fighting for their right to suffrage alongside white women, but white women prioritized themselves at that time. They said that they should be the next ones, after the passage of the 15th Amendment, which gave, black men the right to vote. They said that they should be next in line to have their right to vote. And so, in doing so, chose their race as much as their gender in that fight. And a lot of the states in making the calculation to pass the 19th Amendment, certainly race was a factor in that as well. So you had mostly white women getting the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And then you had, in 1920, Native American women weren't even recognized as citizens in this country at that time. You had Asian women and Latinas in this country who, faced barriers to the ballot because of language issues, right? And so you had black and brown women of color who had to fight twice as hard for their access to the ballot, which they would not get really fully until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so what you've seen and what I wrote on the centennial of suffrage last summer was that, where are we 100 years later? I think what we know is that in the 100 years since white women have had access to the ballot is that, a lot of that time has been, as they have, and certainly not all of them, but many of them, in choosing, prioritizing their race over their gender, have contributed to systems of oppression around race and gender issues in this country. But Black and brown women, even though they've only had their access to the ballot for about half the time, have used that access to really help to bring about a freer and fairer democracy, not only for themselves and their own households and their own community, but really for the country, because we know that Black and brown women, are disproportionately impacted negatively across so many aspects of our society. And so when they vote on their own behalf, they often improve conditions for everyone, through the policies that they support and push. And so, the dynamics that were present 100 years ago during the suffrage movement, a lot of those same dynamics in the organizers and activists that I speak to are still present today. White women, after they got their access to the ballot in 1920, really didn't continue to fight as hard, for the ongoing push for suffrage for all women, right? And other marginalized groups, whereas Black women and brown women and marginalized folks have had to continue to be vigilant to protect their very fragile access to democracy, which we see, playing out even as we speak in state legislatures across the country. They're looking to curtail access to the ballot, even as, Congress is now considering possibly legislation that could expand voting rights and make it easier for more people to participate in our democracy. Woodrow Wilson, to bring him into the conversation was so interesting because, like I said, in 1913, when he becomes president, the suffrage movement is really, kind of inching towards its peak. And he was not necessarily, his support, he wasn't opposed to suffrage initially, but his support for suffrage was kind of lukewarm in the beginning. But that is something that changes and evolves. He had a relative who was a suffragette, a very prominent suffragette. And I think that helped to kind of inform his own evolution. He ends up eventually giving an address to Congress in support of the 19th Amendment. And even though that address didn't necessarily, that didn't move the Senate to approve the 19th Amendment, he continued to speak out in favor of women's access to the ballot, especially after you had women participating in World War I. He saw their patriotism, he saw their commitment to this country, and argued that they should also be able to participate in this democracy as full citizens, to have the privileges as well as kind of the burdens, right, of defending our democracy, that voting was a way that women could defend this democracy as well. And so I always feel like this is a really interesting part of Wilson's legacy for me, and as somebody who now works in a newsroom where I get to think a lot more intentionally about the role of gender in politics, because before that, I think I mainly looked at President Wilson through the lens of race in politics, and his role really, he did not have kind of the same evolution on race as president. He was somebody who actually, was harmful to Black Americans, especially Black Americans with roles in the federal government when he was president. And the federal government was really the way that Black Washingtonians made their way into the middle class. After the Civil War, after Reconstruction, like they get jobs in federal government and begin to make lives for themselves. And so him rolling that back is certainly a stain on his legacy. That I think has to be discussed as part of that legacy, even for all of the visionary things that he did do around democracy. That was certainly not necessarily one of them. So I bring that up because, we talk about kind of this national reckoning around race and gender that we've been in. Certainly the national reckoning on race that kind of exploded last summer, even in the middle of a pandemic. But also, the reckoning on gender that has been happening for the past few years, obviously with the Me Too movement pushing so much of that. This reckoning is really about the interrogation of institutions, right, and institutional figures, and the story that we tell ourselves about who and where we are as a country. And President Wilson's story is definitely a huge part of that. And that was something that frankly, Princeton was reckoning with even before last summer, right? We know that they have been having these conversations as a community. to talk about who he was and to really consider the totality of his legacy, which I think is important for all institutions to do, right? I mean, the conversation that we're having around Confederate statues and building names, and the conversation that other universities are having about their connection to slavery and how they maybe benefited from slavery and the legacy of that benefit even until today. Like, these are important questions that we have to ask, and the conversation around Woodrow Wilson is absolutely part of that. And so I think the last thing that I would say before you and I kind of get into conversation, Elizabeth, is, 100 years after suffrage, you really saw women just factoring in such a huge way into the 2020 election. And I think even before the pandemic, this was an election that felt hugely consequential to women. They saw, women of color certainly saw this election in existential terms. But even so many white women that I talked to, especially after Charlottesville, were really kind of wrestling with the idea that you heard Joe Biden articulate a lot on the campaign trail. Is this who we are? Is this who we want to be as a country? And so the questions of identity, questions of what it means to be an American, what it means to be a white American right now. Like, I think that was certainly something that women were thinking about. But then the pandemic happens, and women have been not necessarily the people who've been disproportionately dying of coronavirus, but in every other aspect of this crisis, women are being impacted by and responding to this pandemic disproportionately. I mean, hundreds of thousands of women, more than 800,000 women dropping out of the workforce because of the child care piece, right? Not having anybody to take care of their children means that they cannot remain in the workforce. Catastrophic. And frankly, unless that issue is addressed, don't know how women are, how this economy gets, back going, much less back to normal. The housing insecurity and food insecurity that we know affects women and children. The caregiving piece, not only caring for small children, but also caring for elderly people, that often falls on women, right? And so all of these things became political for women. And you saw that at the ballot box. The story that I wrote on election day was about the idea that women were going to be the deciders of the 2020 election. And I think that is exactly what ended up playing out. Even in the midst of a pandemic, you had women who were willing to risk, in some cases, their own health to make sure that they were in line, casting their ballot and participating in this democracy, because they wanted to hold their elected officials accountable up and down the ticket, from president all the way down to the local level. They wanted to elect people that could respond to this moment and to help to create a new normal, both around the pandemic and just around the direction of our democracy. So, with that, I guess I'll just close my remarks, but I think that it is very appropriate that we are having this conversation, and thinking about Woodrow Wilson's legacy and all of this, but also, just kind of bringing it forward and thinking about the ongoing efforts for suffrage and
change in talk about race and dynamics in the United States.
Well, I mean, I do think that Charlottesville was a pivotal moment, both of the previous administration, but also for the country. I will say, though, that for a lot of Black journalists, and I covered race, like you mentioned in my introduction, I covered race before I really covered politics full time. And, honestly, to cover politics now, you really do have to have a working knowledge of the history of the racial dynamics in this country, and certainly in our politics, right? So, for a lot of us, we kind of saw this coming. I mean, the election of the first Black president in 2008 certainly was not the post-racial moment that a lot of people wanted to believe that it was. If anything, it was the beginning of the latest kind of hyper-racial era in our politics. And you saw the Tea Party was certainly part of that. But we didn't really acknowledge kind of the racial undertones of the Tea Party's origins. And then, you fast forward to the 2016 election, a lot of what we saw at the former president's rallies, there were racial aspects to that as well that folks were reluctant to call out and point out for what it was. And just the idea that racism was a factor in the 2016 election. And so by the time you get to Charlottesville, while I think that was something that was horrifying to a lot of the country, it should not have been surprising. Because the debate and the defense of Confederate monuments, is something that we were grappling with even before that. The Charleston shootings, sparked a conversation about Confederate monuments, right? And you saw the backlash there, folks not willing to let go of some of these monuments, wanting to defend them as part of, the country's heritage. So, again, shocking and upsetting, yes. Surprising, not necessarily. And even, you take the events of January 6th, the insurrection, right? Horrifying to Americans. And not just the folks at the Capitol, but all of us were so horrified to see that. But again, the logical conclusion of saying that the election was rigged, of questioning the validity of black voters in cities across this country, right? We cannot, these things were avoidable, yes, but not unpredictable. And so I do think that as history looks back on things like Charlottesville and the insurrection, I think that maybe I would hope that folks are better able to kind of connect those dots and see this in its totality as opposed to kind of individual instances of unrest, But part of our story, our the unfinished business of our democracy, which is reckoning with the legacy of slavery and racism in America.
Right. No, I have to say I agree. It's this very long compendium of events that it's really a thread.
Yes.
And I see like a needle and thread that you have to weave these things together, and only on the shoulders of giants, only in 100 years, over a long period of time are we really going to be able to see this as for a much bigger picture than what actually is happening one news event at a time.
Yeah.
And I do appreciate when you say Joe Biden says that's not who we are today. That actually is. I remember listening to Michelle Obama use those very words during when she was first lady, saying that's not, and it was about Princeton and Woodrow Wilson,
yes.
In fact, saying that's not who we are today. And I appreciate that he's adopted that and saying that's not who we are today.
Yeah. But it is an open question, right? I think folks are asking themselves, is this who we, there were so many, especially white Americans who after Charlottesville were saying, I'm not associated with that. I may have voted for the president. I may be a Republican, but I reject what happened here. Right. And so really that was the question, is this who we want to be as a democracy? And I think that is what a lot of people are thinking about going forward. Is this, I live in Philadelphia. I think a lot about what it means to be a citizen right now, what revolution looks like right now, who gets to protest, who gets to participate in this democracy. And these are questions that we have been asking, since our founding as a nation, and that we must continue to keep asking, because I think that we learned that, democracy is neither guaranteed nor something that just happens without our being vigilant about it.
Someone's asked a question, how did part of Southern white men play into who pushed white women to make a choice, get their voting rights, or include black women? And sad to say, white women didn't stand up to this push by men. So I guess the question is, how did the part of Southern white men play into this?
Well, Southern white men who were elected officials, as states were state by state, they were ratifying the 19th Amendment. Tennessee was one of the last states to ratify the 19th Amendment. Georgia, for those folks, the calculation was absolutely also about how black voters would factor into that, the ratification, what that was going to mean. And, because black women, even though they didn't have the right to vote, were absolutely politically active at that time. And they had to be, because for black men who did have that right to vote, to access that or to try to expand that, especially in the South, was very dangerous. I mean, you have to remember, this was also the height of lynching in America, and a lot of lynchings were meant to serve as a form of voter intimidation, right? If black men were found to be trying to register people to vote or to be participating in voting themselves, they could be lynched. And so black women often were the ones who picked up that mantle of political activism, even though they did not even have the right to vote in many cases. So, Southern white men, and not only in terms of extrajudicial violence to suppress voting, but also at the federal and legislative levels, sought to keep black men, but also black women from the ballot.
So let's turn our conversation a little bit to the 19th, and
Yeah.
And this is, you just signed a book contract
I
with
did.
Simon Schuster.
I did. Thank you for mentioning that.
Tell us a little bit about it.
I am somebody who covered then Senator and also Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris when she launched her bid for president in 2019 on Martin Luther King Day. I covered that and just really, she announced her run in the spirit of Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman to run for president in 1972, almost 50 years ago. And I was really curious about how she would fare in this very crowded and diverse field of Democrats, but also, as somebody who was seen as a front runner from the time that she entered that race. And so, what ended up kind of unfolding over the course of that year was that she had a lot of the baggage of being a front runner and very few of the benefits, which is why she was off the ballot, by the end of the year, before anybody even got to cast one ballot for her in the actual primary once that began in earnest. But, kind of the same, some of the same factors that I believe held her back, namely her race and her gender, in terms of people seeing her as electable, absolutely were assets to her as she, was in that very qualified and capable and talented pool of women being considered to be Joe Biden's running mate, right? And why she ultimately was selected, because of the boxes that she checked, but also because of her lived experience as a black woman in the midst of everything that kind of was happening at the time that he made that decision. And so now with Kamala Harris being the second most powerful person in the world, I'm writing a book about what the future of black women's political leadership is and why it matters that a black woman is in the second most powerful position in the world, what that does for the political imagination of this country, to have a woman and a person of color for the first time serving as vice president. Representation matters in this country, and really just in society, period. When people see somebody doing something, that enables them to see people coming behind them that can maybe do the same thing. If they see her looking vice presidential, what does that mean for this country maybe finally getting its first woman president, right? We've seen a black person lead this country before, but never a woman. And so, it's interesting. Shirley Chisholm, when she ran for president, knew that she wasn't necessarily going to win, but it was about raising the prospect and to challenge people to think about this. And she said during her campaign, there's not going to be a woman president until there's a woman vice president. And now there is. So I'm going to be exploring what all of that means, and also just kind of the perils and the pros of being a first, something that she's done several other times in her life. But certainly this is the biggest first that she's ever occupied. And even as we look at her and through that kind of pioneering lens, also it's about just the idea of normalizing women's leadership, because the more we do that, nobody comments on Speaker Pelosi being a woman every single time she lifts that gavel, right? Like that she's the Speaker of the House. So covering Kamala Harris as the Vice President of the United States is probably the most important aspect of my job that I can do right now.
Don't you think it's surprising that it's taken from Shirley Chisholm to now? I mean, that's a long window. Seems like that door, not that it was closed, but it just that Kamala Harris is the first really to be presenting herself. I mean, we've got Maxine Waters. We've had a few others,
sure,
but that's a very long period of time. And I don't think how many young people who might have voted for Kamala actually know about Shirley Chisholm.
Correct. And it is, there is such I really am looking forward to folks talking more and more about Shirley Chisholm as we get closer to the 50th anniversary of her historic run for president, because there is a lot to unpack there, and people do need to know her story, because so many people, so many women in our politics today were inspired by her kind of just bold and unapologetic leadership, right? But I mean, you think about, President Wilson and just his kind of global perspective. Think about women's leadership, even outside of the United States. There are so many women outside of America who have seen a woman leading at the highest levels in their respective countries, right? And that still hasn't happened here. And that, in what we purport to be, the best democracy in the whole world. And women, again, being the majority of the electorate and the majority of the population, how has that not happened? And what I learned, covering a Democratic primary where you had 6 women running, historic number of women running, right? Was really, it was really instructive, because just notions of electability, which I work tirelessly to obliterate every single day, because, people are electable when we elect them. Period. That's the criteria for being electable, right? Or it should be. But also just questions around women's ambition and perceptions around that. And not just from men, by the way, from women as well. And so until we kind of overcome those barriers of perception and, like I said, imagination, really, it's not going to happen for us here either. But I think we continue to get closer. Shirley Chisholm certainly, made so much progress, but I think that, the ascent of Vice President Harris will do even more to further that goal, which is overdue, to your point.
One of the things I see is, and goes back to Woodrow Wilson, is that we as Americans today feel like we need to save the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
That women in other countries, we need to free those women and save those women. When we ourselves look, and we're not really as emancipated as many other countries and many other women across the world. And there's a similarity to Woodrow Wilson in having this vision of peace, world peace, and yet in his own country doesn't have that same level of equality for his own people. So it's this almost like this American feeling that we need to save the world, but we don't even look in our own backyard.
Yeah.
And there's just, to me, a similarity that you see over and over again, that we're all looking out to save the world and not thinking about our neighbor. So, next question. How can we properly discuss Woodrow Wilson's role in establishing the League of Nations, leading to the United Nations, while acknowledging his racism?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just I think the answer is in your question. Like, we have to talk about both, right? Like, you don't talk about one without talking about the other. And just as you said, this kind of like American exceptionalism is truly to confront this reality, right? To confront the unfinished business of our democracy, and to grapple with the reality that racism is still a factor in our country. I think it is remarkable, regardless of what your politics are, it is remarkable to have a president who is saying, even the first month that he has taken office, in his inauguration speech, to talk about the threat of white supremacy in America, right? Or to talk about why racial equity should be a priority for all Americans, right? The idea that racial inequality is harmful to white Americans too. That is something that has the potential to be really transformational for us as a democracy, because we know that we have not lived up to the ideals of our founding, right? Of what it says in the Constitution, and making that real for every single person who is a citizen of this country. And so by acknowledging that, while also acknowledging the good, the thing about America is, when we talk about our origin story, we talk about our, the bright parts of our democracy, we can't talk about those enough, right? But the uglier parts of our democracy, it's always, we need to move on. Like, why are we still talking about this? Well, because we have barely begun to talk about it.
So with that conversation, I've barely begun to talk about it. How, for instance, a house like the Woodrow Wilson house, and this conversation in today's, the United States, and today's politics about should we change names on houses, or should we take down Confederate statues, or what's your take on, or what have you seen as a reporter on how this is being handled across America? Whether we change names, or we whitewash over stories like Woodrow Wilson, or we take down statues, or tell us a little bit about your experience on what you're covering and how the different perspectives that you've seen.
At its core, I'm somebody who's written about race for most of my career, but really journalism at its core is about leaving as honest and accurate a record behind as possible, right? And part of that for me has always been to be as honest and accurate and to tell the truth as much as possible about race in America. And so what I think is, while we are having this reckoning, particularly around monuments, buildings, individuals whose names are on those monuments and buildings, telling the truth about who those people were, as an opening for an opportunity to have a different conversation about their legacies, is what we really should be doing, right? Being here right now, talking about the legacy of Woodrow Wilson, not just to revere him, but to look at that legacy and to say, how can we do things differently? What can we learn from this man and his legacy that allows us to imagine a new way forward, right? Like, that can be part of it, but only if we are honest about who he was, good and bad, right? And what that can mean for our democracy. You can't just take the good parts of his legacy and say, let's carry that forward. It's like, no, we can also say, well, he didn't get this right. He didn't get the race piece right. What is it that he got wrong, and how can we do better as a democracy going forward?
It's a very hard conversation, because as you pointed out before, people don't really want to hear the facts.
Right.
You don't want to hear the.
But it is so important. It is so important, and it is not about it is about being honest, right? And some of those truths are difficult. But I think if you focus on the facts as opposed to the emotions of it, as opposed to people's personal attachments to individuals, that is how we move forward.
Well, and that's actually what the Woodrow Wilson House is trying to do, is to tell a truthful and accurate account of history, whether blemishes and all, because that's the only way we feel as a house that's what our job is to really bring these conversations to light.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have another question. The House of Representatives has a great history blog with many articles on Shirley Chisholm, if possible, if people are looking to learn more about her. So they've shared
and photographs.
And photographs as well.
Because she was, what a force she was. At 95 pounds, I could talk about her for another hour, but just really such a remarkable American, and just the way that she, her political imagination, it was really a once in a generation political figure.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other things that I found about on the 19th on the newsletter, and the things that you cover, are are not just about, well, as you mentioned in the beginning talk about the inequities for women during this pandemic, for instance.
Yes.
It's usually the women who are suffering the most. We're the ones who are giving up our jobs, we're staying home with our children. This is going to be setting this whole generation of women back in terms of promotion in the workplace, continuing to earn, decent living wage and salaries. What do you, when in your reporting, what are you seeing? What are the hottest stories? What are other people covering? Can you share us a little bit about what you're coming up with?
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning the newsletter, by the way, which I would encourage everybody here to subscribe to because it's free and it comes out every single day. You can go to 1919thnews.org and subscribe to our newsletter. So we have been covering what we call the She Session, which, really all of these inequities were present before the pandemic, but they've really been laid bare in very stark terms over the past year. And so, this is why I'm so glad that we are in this setting, because there is a relationship between folks' lived experience and policy, right? And the ability of government to respond. And I think that has been something that's been so striking just over the past month, seeing an administration that is saying we are going to respond to people who are hurting and suffering in this country. We are going to figure out a response to this pandemic that is national, because we've had an absence of a national plan, and we've seen what a disaster that has been, and a disaster particularly for women who are small business owners who are trying to stay open, who need financial resources but have not necessarily been able to take advantage of the same programs as everybody else, particularly women of color as well. The minimum wage piece is such a huge part of this pandemic relief package that is being debated right now, in the House this week. They could be voting by the end of this week on that package, right? $1.9 trillion in a package that we know that could really significantly benefit women. A child income tax credit that could alleviate poverty for half of the nation's children. Like, that's transformative. We know that the women are most of the folks who are housing insecure, or their children are food insecure. The education piece, we keep talking about how we can get children back in classrooms, and while that's not necessarily something that the president can do something about or Congress can do something about, helping those localities get the assistance that they need to be able to reopen safely, right? So because that's going to be so much of a part of the beginning of how we get our economy back on track, right? If you don't have anywhere for your child to go during the day, how are you going to possibly go back into a workplace? That's not going to happen. So for us, certainly we are focused a lot on the equity response, like what is the equitable response to this pandemic, both in terms of the economic piece, but also the vaccine rollout, which we know has not been equitable. And so what can government do to address that for communities who are battling both kind of a historic skepticism, which is rightly earned because of the history of African Americans and the medical industry, but also for people who do say, okay, maybe I saw the vice president get her vaccine. Okay, I'm convinced. I want to go get one. Well, they don't have the same access. They don't know where to go to get a vaccine. Or maybe there's not a community center in their area that has the vaccine, right? So them having access when they do want to get it is also something that the administration, has an obligation to address. And if for no other reason, because, these are the people that put them in office, right? Like, these are the voters that voted for them, even in the middle of a pandemic. And so I'm definitely looking at all of the economic and public health issues that could be impactful for the folks who have been most impacted by the pandemic.
Interesting, because as you said, it's the accessibility and the information for people to find out how to get the vaccine is really a challenge. as well. A lot of it is you need technology to get online.
Yes.
And some of them, if you're starting with a rollout for people who are over 75, a lot of them have that technological skill.
I mean,
or as it was done, they don't have the access to it. So
you're exactly right.
It's a real challenge. It's definitely a real challenge. And you also see this discrepancy between people of color and white people who have greater access to the vaccine just by the economics of it.
Yes.
I mean, you see, in fact, I've spoken to people in Washington D.C. and they say they've gone into communities to get their white people.
That's right.
In Washington D.C. to get their vaccine in a community they've never really been in Washington before.
That's right.
More of an inner city.
And that's the thing with a lack of a national plan. You've got. I mean, this thing is the Hunger Games right now. Folks are doing whatever they can to get a vaccine, even if it means going into some of these marginalized communities, even if it means going to another state. I mean, we've seen reporting, Canadians that are snowbirds going down to Florida to get vaccinated. It really, the absence of a national strategy, it is imperative that folks have information so that otherwise, the president has a goal of getting 100 million shots in the first 100 days. Like, we don't get to that if people don't know how they're supposed to do that. Even as the vaccines are being shipped out, states are starting to get them, they're ramping that up. But once they get to those states, what happens then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So another question that I found on the website
mm-hmm.
and on your newsletter is you cover a lot about LGBTQ
yes.
And religious freedoms, and do you want to talk a little bit about that and your coverage?
Yes. So again, when we initially envisioned this newsroom, obviously a lot of the focus was on women, women off the coast, women who have been historically underrepresented. But what we came to realize fairly quickly was that marginalized communities, specifically LGBTQ folks, did not really have a mainstream platform for their issues, which again are the issues of a lot of Americans, but they are being disproportionately affected, right? But they are also participants and they're a part of this democracy, and we must bring them along, and they must also be reflected as part of our democracy. And so we hired a reporter to focus specifically on these issues, Kate Sosin, and they are really doing such an amazing job of highlighting really just what it means to be LGBTQ in this country, both in the previous administration and they saw this election as existential. Their voter access was something I learned a lot about, through their reporting. And even now, what is the administration going to do to address LGBTQ Americans? You saw Joe Biden in one of the many executive orders that he did in this first month, striking down that transgender military ban. That's huge. Talk and starting to talk about, we're raising questions about how we hit the 500,000 dead milestone, that very grim milestone yesterday. We don't know how many of those folks were LGBTQ because they're not collecting that data, right? These are the kinds of things that we have to be asking. We can't, because these folks cannot be invisible or erased from our democracy because they're an integral part of it, and they are a voting constituency. So at the very least, as political journalists, it is our responsibility to cover this community. I'm very glad to say that very early on, we recognized that part of our mission at the 19th, part of that asterisk, if you will, for us was to include the LGBT community in our coverage.
I think, I didn't realize that was what the asterisk was for, so I appreciate you explaining that.
Absolutely.
I like that. I'm going to start, I hope it's not copyrighted. I might put on asterisks on some of the things we do.
Listen, it literally, the definition of an asterisk, it is to denote the omission of something. And so, while we wanted to name our newsroom after the 19th Amendment, and while we were proud to do that, the asterisk in the logo we felt was important, and we like explaining why there's an asterisk there, because people do need to know the full truth about the suffrage movement, and frankly, we need to be including Black women in any conversation that we have about the suffragists. You know, who they were, right? Like, it wasn't just Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and we have to talk about, you know, Mary Church Terrell and Frances E.W. Harper and so many, Mary McLeod, but so many others. Like, we don't talk about them, and their stature is not, you know, at the same level as we kind of revere some of these white women who, you know, we know were at the, you know, front of the line at that women's march 100 years ago for suffrage. So
you grew up in Atlanta.
Yeah.
In your education, when you were a child, did you learn about the Black suffragists?
No.
Did you learn, or is it? No, it was missing
No,
from your education.
I learned about Susan B. Anthony and folks like that. And so, you know, had I not sought out that history for myself, I would not have known. And because it was not being taught, and I think, you know, they were omitted because they were omitted at that time, right? Like if they were not among the people who got the right to vote in 1920, I guess maybe some historians thought, well, why should we include them as suffragists? But they were absolutely there, and we must let people know that they were there, even though they had to continue to fight for their rights for so much longer.
Right. Well, I think it's also a commentary on American education.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Our civics lessons are just not complete. And that's something that definitely needs to change. I hear, one of the things that I hear over and over again about the topics that we cover during our Tuesday speaker series is, I never learned that in school.
That's right.
Why didn't I learn that? How could I be a relatively well-educated person and not know that? So,
I just did a talk on this. There was I did a summit with a couple of women documentarians. Unladylike was the film that they made, and it is about the underrepresentation of women in social studies and civics in our education system, and how we must change that. That needs to change, because visibility and representation matters. These narratives matter. And, you know, if girls and boys, frankly, in our education system are not seeing that history being told and told accurately, you know, what they grow up believing about who and where we are as a country is wrong.
Well, that's something that we're trying to change. One of the other things too is, we look back, and maybe you have some perspective on this. If we look back 100 years in the future, or we look back in 100 years from now, we look back and we say, what are they doing in 2021 that is just kind of shocking, that is going to be really, people in 100 years from now are going to be talking about as, I can't believe my grandmother did that, or I can't believe my grandfather actually stood for that. And I give that the example of, you know, who was the first woman voter in your family 100 years ago? I look back, some women chose not to vote, and you think, how could that be? So, if you were to look, I know it's a little bit of a complicated question, but if you 100 years from now, looking back for today, what do you think that we're doing today? You would say, gosh, it's going to be seen as a little crazy 100 years from now.
6 women ran for president, and none of them made it through the primary. Like, how do we still not have a woman president? I think that people will be surprised. Whenever it happens, people will be surprised at how long it took to happen. They won't understand why it took so long. They won't. And they're like, women have the right to vote for 100 years, and 100 years later, they still didn't have a woman, like the woman who never ran the country. It was how long before there was a woman Speaker of the House? You know, like people will be confused by that. I think.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Because it will have happened 100 years from now. Like, I believe that. I do believe that. And I will say, when Barack Obama was elected, I did not think that, well, I thought it was something that might happen in my lifetime. I didn't think it would happen as early in my life as it happened. But I do feel that there will be a woman president before I am an old woman. you know, because it's just overdue. And I do think that that is what people will look up and say in 100 years, like, wow, it took that long. Why? What was wrong with America?
One last question before we go. Your Twitter handle is at emarvelous.
It is.
Okay. How did you get that?
You know what? It was actually a nickname that I was given by a friend at my first Daily News internship. One of my closest friends to this day. That was what she called me when we met, when we were doing our internship, and it just stuck. And so, yeah, that's my handle on Twitter and Instagram. And I thought about changing it, but it's too late now. It's already out there. It's like having a phone number for a long time. You don't want to confuse people.
Oh my gosh, it's like a superpower. It's so
It is like
good.
a superpower.
Really good. So you have a number of superpowers. Thank you for sharing them with us today.
Thank
It
you,
was really great
Elizabeth.
to talk to you.
This was amazing.
And
Thrilled that you were able to join us today. You gave us such a comprehensive talk and an understanding of the importance of this topic, and especially in the relevance in today's world. That is the whole purpose of the Woodrow Wilson House Speaker Series: is to find topics that are relevant to today and bring them to light. There is not much that's changed the Wilson House 100 years ago. You can see the background. This house is historically preserved. The one thing that has changed is the conversation. And that conversation has broadened and has expanded. And I'm so happy that you were part of today's conversation. This speaker series is brought to you every Tuesday, I should say second Tuesday and fourth Tuesday of every month. It is brought through generous donations from supporters of the Woodrow Wilson House. These supporters are Carrie Fuller, Nancy Bliss, Ed Gerber, and Christopher Keller. So I'd like to give a special shout out and thanks to them for making this talk possible today. Next talk will be again the second and fourth Tuesday of each month. Join me in 2 weeks to speak with Dr. Lenitra Berger from George Mason University as she talks about her new book that's just come out called Irma Stern and the racial paradox of color and in South Africa in modern art. It is called The Audacities of Color. So join me on Tuesday, March 9th for that talk with Dr. Lenitra Berger. I thank you again, Errin, and I appreciate you joining us today at the Woodrow Wilson House for the speaker series. Stay safe and everyone stay engaged. I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.